Hey, I'm Matt, and today on Grace Online, we are going to be talking about a mental and emotional struggle that so many of us face on a daily basis. The feeling that we're just not good enough, that things in our life are not perfect, but they need to be. And no matter how much we try to have it all together, our pursuit of control and perfection leaves us feeling exhausted and depleted, and feeling like God is distant from us. But how do we stop these feelings of guilt and disappointment? Not to mention the pressure when everything and everyone else around us seems to have it all together. Let's find out right now.
I spent a lot of time on the beach growing up. Every summer, my mom's entire side of the family would rent out this beach cottage, and we'd spend as many hours as possible out in the hot sun, which is not a good idea for somebody with a complexion like me, but I did survive. But when we'd get out to that beach, one of the things my cousins and I would do was we would build the largest sandcastles we possibly could when the tide was out. And the competition was actually seeing whose sandcastle could survive the incoming tide once it came back. And being a kid, trying to build a sandcastle, you do things that later in life I've realized don't make any sense. Like I built a moat around the sandcastle, which now I'm realizing that we were below sea level. So a moat wasn't going to help that castle survive water anyways. But we'd try to build these castles, and the one rule we had for them was it couldn't just be like a mound of sand that you built up really tall so that it would stand above the waves. It had to look like a castle. And so while we're building this big structure, we're also like putting in little details, like carving out little blocks and steeples and stuff like that into the sand to make it look something like a castle, to make it look right. And inevitably, what would happen at the end of the low tide is as the waves were coming in, our sandcastles, before a wave actually even hit them, would fall apart because it was made of sand and it couldn't sustain the weight and the pressure we had put on it to be as big and ornate and filled with as many details as we had put into it. And today we're actually talking about the spiritual version of this, the pursuit of perfection. It's that constant need to do more and more, to do better and better, add one last thing, one last more thing, until your psyche can't take it anymore and you end up snapping or you fall apart like a sandcastle. And whether you're a Christian or not, many people fall into the trap of believing that in order to be loved or in order to be accepted, you have to be perfect. And this belief can even affect the way that you view God, and you can even convince yourself that for God to even love you, you need to get your life in perfect order first. And maybe the reason, or one of the reasons that you have enjoyed following Jesus is you feel like you've become a better person as a result. Or maybe one of the reasons you've decided to not follow Jesus for most of your life is because you believed that God was some sort of cosmic perfectionist, and Christians are a bunch of people that think that they're perfect. I think for all of us, regardless of where you stand spiritually, we've all had a sandcastle moment. Either an area of our life like our performance, our relationships, or our looks, where we were haunted by this sense, by this feeling that we're never enough, we're never good enough, we're never perfect enough. See, perfectionism is when the pursuit of good goes bad. It's the line that we cross when we obsess over what's right, where it actually can become wrong. There's a guy named Paul who wrote most of the New Testament, and in his writing, he wrote to a number of different churches. And he wrote to them about things they need to correct and some encouragement. Most of those letters were only about like 4 or 5 chapters. But there was one church, this church that was in a city called Corinth, that he wrote 2 full letters to, and they weren't just 4 or 5 chapters. They were actually each like 14 chapters. This church was far from perfect. But that's actually good news for us because there are some things that Paul writes to them about that he doesn't get to in other letters that actually can help us with things like getting over those emotions and thought processes that haunt us daily. And so he wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 that we use God's mighty weapons, not worldly weapons, to knock down the strongholds of human reasoning and to destroy false arguments. We destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God. We capture their rebellious thoughts and we teach them to obey Christ. See, if you're ever going to defeat the negative thoughts and harmful emotional cycles that might haunt you, you'll first need to be willing to face them. If you're going to capture a thought, you first have to identify what that thought is and where it comes from. And when it comes to being like paranoid over perfection, when it comes to feeling like you need to perfect your life, all of those thoughts, all of that worry actually comes from this one idea that you're not ever good enough, you're not enough, and you're not perfect enough. So if you're ever going to overcome that paranoia about perfection, you first need to admit that we're not perfect. Now, some of you might need to say that out loud. And so I want to give you the opportunity to simply admit out loud, I'm not perfect. Now, if you're sitting with somebody, I want you to look at them and say, you're not perfect. Now, I think for all of us, that one's a little bit easier. But Romans 3 actually tells us, it says, as the scriptures say, no one is righteous, not even one. And if I'm really transparent with you right now, I don't like this verse. Because I think to any of us who you try to live a good life, you try to do things the right way, you try your best. Like I wish that this verse read, no one's righteous, but at least Steve is trying, right? Like all of us would like it to at least give us a pat on the back. Like I see your effort, but what I want you to know is that the writer here isn't trying to communicate that we're all hopeless. He's not saying nobody's righteous, so just give up. He's actually communicating what he leads to is this idea that there are aspects of a relationship with God that you can only experience if you first admit that you're not perfect. Like the only way you can actually receive grace is first admitting that you need grace. And actually, there's a beautiful example of this in the life of Jesus. On the very last night that Jesus spent with his closest followers, he was with them in this house, and it's the house where he ends up having his last meal with them. But right before that meal, he ends up doing something unexpected. And so in John chapter 13, it says, Jesus knew that the Father had given him all authority over everything, and that he had come from God, and that he would return to God. So Jesus has been given the authority to do anything, and he's going to go back to God. Like imagine if you had been given the authority to do what you want, and you knew that you were going to return to God, you're going back to heaven. Like I think some of us would be tempted to act selfishly because we know that it's guaranteed we're going back to God. Jesus didn't use this perfection that he had, this authority that he had for himself. It says, so he got up from the table, he took off his robe, and he wrapped a towel around his waist. And he poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around them. Then when it came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you don't understand now what I'm going to do, but someday you will. No, Peter protested, you will never, ever wash my feet. Now, Jesus had already washed a number of the other disciples' feet. In fact, he might have washed every single other disciple's feet up to Peter. So what's different about Peter's feet? Probably nothing, but to Peter, these were Peter's feet. Like Jesus, you can wash everybody else's feet. You can look at their feet. They're filthy feet. It's vulnerable. It's uncomfortable, but I don't want you looking at mine. These are mine, and I'd like to hide them from you. Have you ever been around somebody who's almost impossible to serve? Maybe you're that person. Like you struggle to not be the one who's serving other people, getting things done, doing things for other people. You struggle to just sit if there's other people that are actively doing things. You don't like the idea of being seen as just receiving something. You need to be doing more than everybody else. That's Peter. Peter had a habit of speaking up and speaking out, even sometimes correcting Jesus, trying to get ahead of the curb, in front of Jesus, outplanning Jesus. Like there's even a moment where Jesus was being escorted by Roman guards and eventually would be crucified, something that he had told Peter and the other disciples was going to happen. And Peter tried to stop it by cutting a Roman guard's ear off. Like Peter is constantly trying to get ahead of what's happening, overplan, try to get in front of Jesus. And so I think the idea of Jesus touching Peter's imperfect, filthy, dirty, grimy feet felt wrong because it was vulnerable. See, in Peter's mind, he needed to be the one who was serving. He needed to be the one who was doing. And if we're really honest with ourselves even, he needed to be the one controlling what everybody else saw about him, all the while keeping his vulnerabilities and imperfections hidden from Jesus. So then Jesus responds in this beautiful way that I think disarms any of us who are nervous about people, especially God, seeing our imperfections. That Jesus simply says to Peter, unless I wash you, you won't belong to me. See, if you never admit that you're dirty, you cannot be washed. If you never admit you're wrong, you cannot be made right. If you are never wrong, then how could God ever forgive you? See, unless you allow yourself to be washed, which would require that you admit that you're dirty, you cannot be cleaned. And so then Peter responds in this beautiful line. He says in verse 9, Simon Peter exclaimed, then wash my hands and my head as well, Lord, not just my feet. See, basically what Simon is saying, what Peter's saying is, Jesus, if the difference between belonging to you and not belonging to you is simply admitting that I need to be cleaned by you, that I'm dirty, then holy crap, like wash all of me because every part of me is imperfect. See, that's the type of grace and joy that you can only experience when you first admit that you aren't perfect. And the story actually takes another turn because Jesus then tells his disciples, after washing their feet, after serving them, that he wants them to go and do the same. Now, going and doing the same is just serving other people. It's washing their feet. It's caring for them in a way that would mean something significant to them. But Jesus washing their feet wasn't an example of Jesus's perfection. Like it wasn't an example like his perfect devil resistance over 40 days in the wilderness. And it wasn't a display of his perfect devotion to God, even up to the cross. All he was asking them to imitate was this act of humble goodness. See, in telling his disciples to go and do the same, Jesus was actually telling his imperfect disciples to imitate God's goodness, not his perfection. Now, that doesn't mean you stop trying to live a holy or a different life for God. That doesn't mean you stop trying to put in the effort to follow God and what he's asking you to do. But what it does mean is that none of us can be made perfect on our own. So what we should aim at following God's goodness, displaying his goodness, and God is going to grow you. He's going to make you more perfect in his he's going to perfect your faith. He's going to work on your faith. He's going to mature your faith. There's an author by the name of Dallas Willard who puts it this way. He says, grace is opposed to earning, but not effort. See, after all, even if you could make yourself perfect, if something is perfect, that would actually mean that it's wrong to change. Like my daughters, I have two daughters, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and they're at this phase of life where they love coloring. And they'll color on everything, a coloring book or even the walls. And so we've actually had to give them these window markers because we have a giant slider in our condo. And so they'll just color all over the slider and vandalize it. I'm not sure if I'm raising the next great artists or vandals. But one of the things they'll ask me to do, though, is to draw different things for them. Like I'll draw a horse, I'll draw a princess, I'll draw a dog, a cat, whatever. And they'll just color over it. They'll color in the lines, which for them, coloring in the lines means coloring every blank piece of that paper. And I'm fine with that for a couple reasons. First of all, it's my drawing, so I get to say what they do with it. But also because it is far from perfect. When I draw a horse, it kind of looks the same as when I draw a dog. So they can color on it. It's far from perfect. But I would never give my girls Sharpies and bring them to an art gallery full of beautiful masterworks, masterpieces that might have taken hundreds of hours to paint or to draw, and tell my girls just to go to town. First of all, because that's not mine, but also because those masterworks feel a lot closer to be perfect. Like, even if you didn't own the painting, you'd say, that feels wrong. Like, you shouldn't just doodle over that, right? Because it feels a lot closer to perfect. In the pursuit of perfection, or if you view yourself as closer to perfect, all that does to you is it makes you more rigid. See, Jesus's biggest struggle was actually with people who thought they were perfect because they believed that changing would be the same as admitting that they were wrong. And God's desire for you is always that you'd be more real with him, not try to be more right than him. There's a pastor by the name of Craig Rochelle who says, the pursuit of excellence will consistently motivate you, but the pursuit of perfection will eventually limit you. And this was the religious elite's problem in Jesus's day. They were so limited by their own need to prove themselves to be perfect. And so Jesus even pointed this out in Matthew chapter 23. So he said, what sorrow awaits you teachers of religious law and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurity. Outwardly, you look like righteous people, but inwardly, your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness. Now, just so you know, because I think the Pharisees tend to get like a really bad rap in church, just so you know, the Pharisees actually did a lot of good things on the outside. Actually, they made copies of the scriptures. Part of the reason why we have so many early copies of scripture is because of people who were devout in their faith and made copy after copy, handwritten, trying to make sure there was no errors so that we'd have a library of these copies of scripture. They would study the scriptures, they upheld the law, they prayed, they taught, they made sacrifices for the sins of the people, but they were so limited by their need to present themselves as perfect that they struggled to admit when they had sinned. And being so wrapped up in their pursuit of perfection led them to judge everyone else who wasn't perfect like they were. And so when they were confronted with the actual perfection of Jesus, they viewed Jesus as a threat, not as an example. And they wanted him killed. See, you can try to control what other people see, but eventually what other people see will end up controlling you. Perfectionism can lead you to do bad so that you won't look bad. And these Pharisees, these teachers of religious law, they presented really well, but internally their attitude towards God and other people were ugly. And that's what perfectionism does. We aren't perfect, but when we try to be or when we pretend to be, it caused us to hide the parts of ourselves that we view as less than desirable. And it leads us to share less and less of our real selves with God and with other people. It's kind of like if your life was this $20 bill. A $20 bill has a certain amount of value, right? It's worth $20. It's worth 2 10s. It's worth 20 ones. It's worth 80 quarters. Like, you get the point, right? But all of us have parts of our life that we think are strengths and we think are weaknesses. Perfectionism says, I need to hide those parts that I don't think are perfect. So I'm going to hide one side. But then we have certain things in our life. Maybe it was a loss of a job. Maybe we just failed in a moment of life, whether it was in a relationship or at work. We didn't perform to the level that we should have. And so we hide that past that we think is uncomfortable or less than perfect. And then maybe we have a certain area of ourselves that we're not that comfortable with. Maybe it's something about my look. Maybe it's something about something I've done before or didn't do before. And then I fold this over again. And slowly, as we let perfectionism take hold, it causes us to fold the bill and present less and less of ourselves, hoping that the one piece that we have left showing will be what actually brings us value. What's interesting is, according to the Treasury, a bill still has its value as long as at least 50% of it is showing. See, God created you in his image, meaning that you have inherent value. the thing that brings your life value isn't the small corner piece that you've settled for as the one thing that you're willing to share and show people. Like when people ask you about you, it's the one thing you're willing to say that, oh, I'm a business professional, I'm earning this much money, or I have this type of career, or I want people to see the awesome car that I'm driving, but we really don't want them to get to know who we are as husbands, as wives, as parents. We want people to know what type of student we are, but we don't want people to know what type of friend we haven't been. God wants you to be able to be comfortable with the imperfect parts of you because he already knows all of you. In fact, there's an author by the name of Brené Brown who put it this way. She said, those who have a strong sense of love and belonging have the courage to be imperfect. So if you're going to choose to aim at one perfect thing in life, the thing that I'd ask you to aim at is to choose perfect love over perfect performance. In 1 John chapter 4, John writes and he says, all who declare that Jesus is the Son of God have God living in them and they live in God. And we know how much God loves us and we've put our trust in his love. God is love and all who live in love live in God and God lives in them. And as we live in God, our love grows more what? Perfect. Like the longer I allow myself to live in God, like I'm dwelling in my relationship with him, I'm investing in my relationship with him, my love, not my performance, but my love is growing more perfect. I'm falling more in love with God, which should be causing me to fall more in love with his mission, his purpose, and people around me. And then it says, so we will not be afraid on the day of judgment, but we can face him with confidence because we live like Jesus here in this world. Such love has no fear because perfect love expels all fear. Now I want you to see what it said there though. It didn't say perfect performance can cast out fear because it can't. Because first of all, you can't be perfect. And even if you were, you'd still be afraid that it wasn't perfect enough. Only perfect love can cast out fear. If we're afraid, it is for the fear of punishment. And this shows that we have not fully experienced his what? Perfect love. So when your performance isn't perfect, you need to remember that God's love is. God doesn't want you to live in fear of not being enough. That God actually wants you to experience his unconditional love. But in order to experience his unconditional love, you need to come to terms with the fact that you've broken every condition that there could have been for that love. That's why it's unconditional. That we've all sinned. We've all disobeyed God. We are all imperfect. We've all at some point lived selfishly towards our own interests, but God still has love for you. And that type of perfect love should free you. See, when Jesus was asked what the most important commandment was, he was actually asked by a guy who was he was a religious scholar, that he was an expert in the religious law. And so he knew God's law in and out. He was probably very devout in his faith. He'd follow it to a T. And so that type of person is usually the type of person when they ask a question, they're looking for the one thing they need to do. Like, what's the one thing I need to do that's most important beyond everything else? If I'm going to have a right relationship with God, what's the one thing I should focus on, God? That way I can check that box and be done. And Jesus surprisingly gives almost like a frustratingly vague answer, because he doesn't say you need perfect church attendance. He doesn't say you need to have a perfect track record of never telling a lie. He doesn't say you need to do this or you need to do this one thing. He says you need to love. And he breaks it up into two sides. He says you need to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you need to love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus says those are the two most important because I'm not separating them. They're equally important. Now, I think for the perfectionist, you kind of get loving God because he is perfect. Like if he is a perfect father, if he's a perfect God, then okay, that makes sense why I'd love him. And so my challenge to you, if you struggle over the paranoia about being perfect, my challenge to you is that you would proactively practice loving imperfect people. So maybe when somebody turns on the road without putting their blinker on, as small of a thing as that might be, if you're tempted to judge them and think to yourself, they must be the worst driver on the planet, like I hope they get hit. Instead of judging them, pray for them. Pray that God would protect them, because they'll probably do it again. Or maybe you have somebody at work who's shown up late 3 days in a row. Rather than judging them and saying, I can't believe that they're showing up late, maybe you should be the person who asks if they need to carpool. And that might mean that rather than showing up 15 minutes early, you only show up 5 minutes early, but let that be okay. See, I'm not telling you to be a worse employee. I'm not telling you to be a worse driver for the sake of people who aren't great drivers. I'm not telling you to be a less devoted to God's call and less devoted to your pursuit of holiness. What I am asking you to do, though, is leave grace for imperfect people so that you can better understand the grace that God has for you.
Man, I hope that you were able to find something from today that was helpful for you. And as somebody with a type A personality myself, it's comforting to know that God chose to love me even before I did anything good or bad. And regardless of my performance, He is there, He knows me, and He wants a relationship with me. And the same is true for you, whether or not that is hard to believe. Listen, if there's anything that I can do to help you or support you, please just let me know. You can text or email me using the info that you see at the bottom of your screen, and I really will reach out and connect with you. Whether that's to answer a question, pray with you, or just give you some encouragement. Now, next week, we are continuing our series talking about how to fight back against living a hurried life and what we can do to find some real rest. It's gonna be great. I'll see you right here for it next time.